Hello, listeners. Welcome to the 12th episode of the Unlocking the Energy Trilemma podcast. Today, we have another international session with Ravi from Mumbai, JAM from Madrid, and our guest, Brad Harkavy from Boston. Brad is the Vice President of Grid Strategy at Oracle Energy and Water, which helps utilities to serve 550 million customers worldwide. Today, we will talk about DRS, distributed energy resources, the new trend to enhance energy transition by confronting centralized power generation. Ravi, JAM, over to you.
Thank you, Ava, and welcome, Brad, to the Unlocking the Energy Trilemma podcast.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about, so excited to be here.
Fantastic. And as we do with all our guest speakers, I would like to ask you to share one fact or a figure that is related to the energy trilemma and related to the topic we will speak today about distributed energy resources.
Yeah, we've been trying to figure this out, this market in general, spending a lot of time kind of refining our strategy lately. And I think the thing that really sticks out to me is the growth in VPPs. We've seen data that it's supposed to have a CAGR of over 38%, even higher in North America, 50% through 2030, which is just a gigantic growth rate. And we've seen some press releases about what Nested Home is doing with NRG with a 1 gigawatt VPP. So just in general, the growth of kind of VPP capacity is really exciting, scary, all good stuff. And that coupled with the kind of demand growth with all the generative AI stuff that's going on is super interesting to us.
Perhaps for the layman, Brad, if you can explain what a VPP is, could be a good start. Yeah.
So the idea behind a VPP is that there are distributed energy resources. It could be a thermostat, it could be an EV, it could be a storage system, it could be solar, and aggregating those into effectively a virtual power plant. In the old days, power plants were outside the city. Power was created by coal or oil or gas or nuclear, and you had a gigantic resource, which we call the generator. The idea behind a VPP is that we have virtual generators or virtual power plants where we can aggregate loads from lots of different sources into the equivalent. And the advantage of that flexibility is that you have lots of resources in lots of places. So that's both the good and the bad. The goodness is that you can solve localized congestion problems. The badness is it just makes what used to be a pretty easy formula for utilities incredibly more complicated.
Great. And what are some of the factors that are driving the growth of DERs? What are the business drivers and some of the strategic benefits of DERs in terms of grid modernization? Yeah.
First of all, I think that calculus changes where you are. And just looking across the US, which we spend a lot of time in, there's 50 different regulatory bodies and 50 different strategies, depending on what state you're in, as to how you approach DERs. And the thing that I find most interesting these days is certainly in mature jurisdictions like California, Arizona, Hawaii, in the Northwest, like Portland. They've been using DERs for lots of reasons. They're transmission constrained, right? They can't get enough power through their networks. They have green initiatives where they want to move away from fossil fuels, reduce their carbon emissions. So lots of reasons for that. The thing that's really interesting to me is as we move into other parts of the country where traditionally DERs were not necessarily part of the strategy, so lower EV penetration, lower solar penetration, what we're starting to see is folks interested in just dropping some storage onto their distribution network so that they can save the cost or the hassle of putting in new transformers or new power lines, right? If you have a constrained part of the network and you don't have to go engineer a new solution, but you can just drop storage in, that's starting to be very financially attractive to utilities. So a long way of saying that the business needs are very different depending on where you are, certainly in the US, and then when you go internationally, lots of lots of different trends. We see a lot of Northern Europe, a lot of wind power on the coast. As you get more centralized, a lot of solar power. You go to Australia, incredibly high penetration of DERs, particularly around solar. And it's not a one size fit all question, right? But in general, the march is undeniable. Also, many utilities are struggling with load growth right now. So DERs allow them to perhaps move a lot faster and a lower cost than traditional power generation approaches.
And Brad, DERs are something new in the electricity mix. So is the regulation supporting the technology, or is the technology still ahead in this race?
Yeah, I think regulation is lagging. I think regulation is also super tricky. I manage there's 50 different jurisdictions and just in the US. There's actually 51, right? Because of the federal government, which has a different agenda than the states. And it's really tricky to separate the economic need, the policy need, and the utilities need from all those things. And by the way, another really legitimate problem with all of this is that the beneficiaries of, particularly on the residential side, of DERs has tended to be the people that were more affluent, that could fund their own solar on their roof, they could buy an electric car, they could buy battery storage for their house. And what that has done, it certainly has made the grid cleaner, but it's also driven up the cost of energy for lots of folks that can't afford it. It's tricky to get policy right. Every policy has unintended consequences. As the government shifts, as we shift out of the Biden era into the Trump era, right, we're going to see significant changes in policy. And whether that will be good or bad, who knows, but we will see changes in policy, right? And that we're all going to have to figure that out.
And is there any state or international country that is really a benchmark in regulation on DRRs?
I'm not sure whether it's just regulatory, but certainly when we see what's happening in Australia, it seems to be leading a lot of the world as far as penetration. A gigantic influence on what's going on is China, which tends to be a completely different market than the rest of the world, but their growth in renewables has been extraordinary. Whether a very tight industrial policy mixed with defense policy is the best policy, not sure. But certainly the Chinese, their march towards solar, EVs, DERs is really extraordinary, right? The amount of renewable power they're putting onto the network every single day is staggering.
And are you saying, Brad, that the regulation in China is keeping in sync with the growth in DERs, or are they lagging in terms of DER regulation?
There's a bigger overlap with a political policy, which is low cost of capital to invest in renewables, and an overall government strategy, right, to really be both a commercial leader in lots of the raw ingredients to a renewable strategy, but also policy tends to move faster there. And there's, if your only metric is penetration of DERs, they're doing great. If you look at the chaos there's going to be as the money policy dries up, and you know, many competitors that are all going to disappear and try to sell to the rest of the world, who knows whether that's exactly the right policy, but certainly they have moved faster than any other part of the world from my observation.
Yeah. So we touched on the growth of renewables and the intermittent and the grid stability issues that it can cause. How do you see the projected growth in DERs and demand flexibility impacting grid reliability in general?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's something we think about a lot. It's like, when does the penetrations of DERs get high enough that utilities need to invest in DERMS or other measures for that stability? And I don't think there's a clear line, but we do know that in places with very high penetrations of renewables, that there's been crazy issues. And one easy example for folks to get their head around is what's happened in Texas, which not necessarily high penetration renewables, but certainly lots of wind power lots of issues with extreme temperature, a deregulated market, or as close to you come to a deregulated market in the US. And that certainly led to grid stability issues. So there's a tipping point there where extreme events cause problems. And that it's probably only 10 or 15% of the utilities in the US that are really concerned about the penetration of renewables. Certainly the California utilities. One way to think about this is we define two types of DERM systems. One is an edge DERMS and one is a grid DERMS. Grid DERMS tends to be driven from a ADMS standpoint, from the guys responsible for maintaining stability of the grid. And then edge DERMS tends to be folks that are managing behind the meter assets, and they are more concerned about visibility and flexibility than they are about grid stability. And that sort of informs your question, because where's the money going, right? Where are people investing from a utility standpoint? And typically, the market for VPP and edge DERMS is much bigger than the market for grid DERMS. But when people are starting to worry about grid stability, that's where we see them making an investment in grid DERMS, right? And that those are long cycle times, right? There's usually a bunch of work up front on installing power flow modeling ADMS before they get to the grid DERMS investment. But that's an abstraction to answer your question. If we look at where the dollars are flowing, right? Is it to grid DERMS or edge DERMS? There is more money for a long time actually flowing into the grid DERMS part of the market than the edge DERMS part of the market, even though the kind of VPP side of the market is going to grow quickly. And the VPP side of the market tends to be driven not by people that care about grid stability, but people that want to make money off of aggregating a bunch of renewables. So there's some, again, natural tension there between developers and market timers, right, that want as much DER capacity as they can aggregate, and the utilities that are excited about that, but just want to make sure the grid doesn't fall down. Yeah, it's a good tension.
Yeah.
For us. Yeah.
You are talking about the grid. You have mentioned rooftop solar, EVs. Let's say all these elements could demand a growth or an expansion in the grid itself. If not, we'll have grid congestion. Currently, we have a curtailment in renewables in some places due to this network congestion.
Yeah.
To what extent distributed energy resources could be complementary to these costly grid build-outs, or even a replacement of those build-outs?
There are parts of the world like Africa, right, where investments are being made at a quicker rate in microgrids, distributed energy, than they are in traditional grid infrastructure. I think in the parts of the world where the grid is more mature, I don't see that happening. I see this is a place where the regulatory framework has a gigantic impact, because at the extremes, if we look at what's happening in California, the very wealthy are buying a bunch of solar and a bunch of batteries and generally relying on that. And only occasionally, when they exceed that capability, do they rely on the grid. So they're occasionally using the grid and they're really not paying their fair share. Again, it depends on where you're at, but I don't see a world where there isn't some sort of central body that's responsible for the integration of lots of DERs, essentially the grid today. The business model for those providers, whether they're just purely wire carriers, whether they're involved with some of the aggregation, the VPP, how they get compensated, that's all a challenge. And this is the trilemma, and utilities are really challenged right now. We talked about energy equity. The cost of capital has gotten much higher, and load growth is going way up, and yet the grid's getting much more complicated. That is a challenge. And if you talk to folks that are much smarter than I am, there is a concern that the current business model for utilities may not be sustainable. That in order for utilities to survive over the longer term, the way they think about IT is going to have to change pretty dramatically, in that it really has to be much more of a SaaS model, much more of a shared services model, these kind of bespoke systems which are designed for large utilities and are managed on-prem. It's just not going to be sustainable over the long term. Utilities are going to have to be leaner, but manage much more complexity, which means they need much better systems, much more cost-effective systems to go after that.
And are there any policy or market mechanisms that are crucial for the deployment of DERs on a more rapid scale that are still outstanding or not resolved? Or even does it even matter if you are a muni or a co-op or an investor-owned utility? Are there any regulatory mechanisms that are impacting this?
That was a softball question. Yes, there are so many challenges from a regulatory standpoint. I don't know if it's regulatory or process, but clearly the biggest impact on DER deployment is the interconnect process. That's at every level. It's at the homeowner level, it's at the grid level, and that process can be impacted by the regulatory framework, and we need to be able to move faster. There's money, there's capital, there's folks that want to do big things from a DER perspective, and they can't connect to the grid, right? They can't get regulatory approval for it. They can't get the utilities to move fast enough. And that is a policy issue.
And Brad, how can utilities leverage on DERMS to optimize the full range of distributed energy resources at the end to bring benefits to those citizens and end users of the electricity grid?
This is super interesting to me too, because we've talked about regulatory framework, but there's an organizational framework within utilities, which is running at cross purposes. And we just saw the first utility where this happened, but there's two schools of DER folks in the organization, right? There's folks that are doing grid related DER management, right? And they care a lot about stability, having direct access, slowing down the process, making sure they can control every resource they can. And then there's the folks that are doing demand response, DER programs. They're trying to enroll as many people into some sort of flexible program that they can control to meet their goals. And getting those folks to talk to each other and operate together has been super challenging. And we're just starting to see RFPs, implementations of what we call aggregator DERMS, where you're taking a behavioral program, right, where you suggest to people to turn down their thermostat, or an automatic thermostat program and a DER program and an EV program and a storage program, and actually integrating those into a single larger entity, a larger VPP. And that's exciting. That's not at all the general rule. And we see that in places where people are just so constrained for new electricity with load growth that they can't manage, right, unless they use every single resource to its optimal capabilities. And specifically, we're seeing that in the Northwest because they're transmission constrained. And we're seeing that in places in the Southwest where they just have crazy load growth between semiconductor factories and data center growth, which is really driving interesting behavior now.
Excellent, excellent. So as we reach a hard stop, I'm just going to throw in a couple of questions rolled into one, and then let Jose do the closing remarks. Obviously, Oracle, in its role as a major supplier in the marketplace, is also well known for its customer engagement modules, such as the O-Power, and for many years. What, in your opinion, differentiates an efficient DERMS platform from a less efficient one? And how should a utility decide on an optimal solution?
Oracle's position in the market is pretty unique, right? Because we can offer solutions that go all the way from the customer care and building, customer engagement, all the way to full-blown power flow, DER optimization, scheduling, right? And most of the traditional providers, certainly on the grid side, don't have that customer engagement piece or the customer piece, or the meter piece. And folks are going to need integrated solutions that they don't necessarily have to be integrated solutions from one provider for certain, but they need to be integrated, and they need to be integrated all the way from the customer engagement side to the grid side. And that's a higher level of reasoning, right? Because you have to look at your investments, not in a chunk of I'm going to buy an edge DERMS solution, or I'm going to buy a program solution, or I'm going to buy a grid solution, but really looking over the horizon and look at both the operating expense and capital expenses for a solution that cuts across all the way from the customer side to the grid side, because increasingly those two sides are going to have to integrate.
Fantastic, Brad. I think creating and managing virtual power plants seems to be part of our future in the energy sector. And let me close with the last question we do to all our guests. If you had a magic wand and if you could unlock the energy trilemma, what would you do with your magic wand?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one for me. So one of the things I'd like to see is a much more of a spirit of really trying to share things like power flow models and data across systems, so that we can have heterogeneous environments where we do get that integrated solution that we talked about, right? And it's been traditionally not in the incumbent's best interest to think about sharing models and sharing data structures across systems, because they want the lock-in. And I think in the end, that's at our detriment. And EPRI's been doing some work on this, but I think it's just starting to change. Like, we're just starting to see folks figure out they can't do it all themselves. But certainly better data sharing, better model sharing across vendors, I think is really significant.
Brad, thank you very much for participating in the podcast. And we'll follow you in the social media and the events we are attending.
Thank you so much for the time today.
Yeah.
I appreciate
Thank you. Thank you, Brad. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
We hope you liked this conversation. Follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe for free to the podcast on the platform of your choice: Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, or Apple. Because in the next episode, Ravi and JAM will speak with Sonia Dunlop, CEO of the Global Solar Council, who will help us to unlock the energy trilemma.